He said, "Oh, men and women complain about each other all the time, but they really shouldn't, because whatever the traits are of modern women, they're the results of the mating choices of men, and vice versa. So men and women have really molded each other by who they mated with and who they didn't."
Roy Baumeister, it's such a joy and an honor to be able to do this. I really appreciate you taking time to come on the show, man. It's wonderful to meet you. Welcome.
No, thank you. Glad to be here. It'll be fun.
I hope so. I was scanning through my notes a little bit ago today, going through trying to decide what of the many different fascinating topics you have covered that I wanted to start the conversation with and begin with. And I thought maybe I would start with a throwaway comment I heard you made on an interview once related to a subject I've long been fascinated by, which is the existence of gay people and how through evolution, gay people, gay men have persisted in the human population. And I know from what you mentioned, the data appears to indicate that there is some overlap between highly successful men, quote unquote, with women and gay men, and that potentially is a working theory as to how gay men essentially exist in human nature and in nature in general. What do we know about that? What's the best explanation we have as far as your understanding is concerned right now about how,
The big
the concept of gay is? Yeah.
First of all, I'm a generalist. I'm trying to put together the big picture, so I'm not an expert in every area, and certainly not in this. But when you consider both nature and culture are against being gay, nature selects based on reproduction, and gay sex doesn't produce any babies. And cultures are often against it too, and punish and stigmatize gay people. So why does it survive? Nature and culture are our two main explanations for everything. My colleague at University of Queensland, Brendan Seach, had a really intriguing answer with a very strong database. I'd seen it suggested once or twice as speculative, and I thought this is a brilliant idea. But, in social science, ideas are cheap, and data is precious. And Zeitz, he got it. He said, okay, gay people, their sex doesn't reproduce. But it turns out the siblings of gay people, especially gay men, they have above average number of sex partners. They are more attractive to others. So you can think of it this way, that reproduction depends on the man and the woman kind of hitting it off. And a total man's man, well, he can usually find women to go along with him because he's really successful, but he doesn't relate that well to them. Some feminine traits help a man relate to a woman. And you could suggest that, well, a lot of feminine traits make him inclined to be gay. So it's a matter of hitting the middle. So the gay man may not have any children, even though he might have a lot of really good friendships and relationships with women. But his brothers and sisters, who perhaps aren't quite as far along as he is, they hit it off really well, and they are sexually interested. The men are interested in women, and vice versa. And so they reproduce perhaps above at an average rate, and that offsets the gay man not producing. It has to. I don't know that this theory is true, but there are not very many plausible theories, and it has to be something like that hits the middle. Because again, nature and culture are against it. Why hasn't it completely disappeared from the gene pool? There must be something good that promotes reproduction, and if a certain amount is good and a little too much makes you not interested in doing it, that's at least plausible. And Zeitz has pretty good data to back that up.
Fascinating. There's another line that I heard you say, and this is related to men and women and male sex drive. And I know there's a concept you have spoken about related to the tragedy of the male sex drive. And you've spoken a decent amount about how much women have basically shaped men. And your answer was, or your comment to this general topic was about if you ask, there were studies done asking men in an ideal world without concern for pregnancy or infection or stigma, how many sex partners would you like to have in your life? And asking the same question to women. And the data that you presented, and maybe I'll just give it to you. What do we know about the studies that have asked men and women that question, and what the differences are between men and women when they respond to that open-ended query?
When I was writing the book, there was a new study that came out, and it was asking first-year college students, so those don't necessarily generalize, and they probably haven't had that much sex, but the women on average wanted to have about 2.5 sex partners, and the men wanted to have 64. So, so there's a lot of disappointment ahead for those young men trying to connect with women who are not nearly as interested in that. I think the evolutionary people make a good point that the men who were more interested in more different partners that probably produced more offspring and were descended more from those men than the men who only wanted to have one or even less than one. So that's there. It doesn't make as big a difference for the women. A woman can only really have one baby a year, no matter how many men she has sex with, whereas if a man has sex with 50 different women, he can have a whole bunch of babies each year.
Hmm.
Um, so, I'm not sure where we're going with this.
Maybe be helpful to hone in on the idea related to how, maybe two ideas, the tragedy of the male sex drive and how women, ironically, and I think that's the word I've heard you say in the past in interviews, that it's ironic that women have really formed men, and one of the ways in which they've shaped men is to give them this sky high sex drive. What do we know about that?
Yes, well, one of the profound comments by David Buss, who's sort of a colleague I know who's really influenced my thinking a lot over the years. He said, "Oh, men and women complain about each other all the time, but they really shouldn't, because whatever the traits are of modern women, they're the results of the mating choices of men and vice versa. So men and women have really molded each other by who they mated with and who they didn't. And take it a step further, if you look at the numbers, women have bred men much more than men bred women. It's just partly because women are choosier about who they'll have sex with. Men of a certain age will have sex with pretty much anyone who's willing. And women are much pickier, so it's given women much more power to mold the male psyche than the men chose molded to women, although both are real. And then this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. The thrust of my thing, I'm trying to come up with a big picture understanding of the human mind and why it is the way it is. And the short starting point is that nature made us for culture. We were shaped by natural selection, but culture is our strategy. It's how we survive and reproduce, and it's working really well where all the other mammal populations are declining and ours is increasing. But part of that requires the bigger brain, which you can't birth a big brain, so humans are born premature by ape standards. Most of the monkeys, they can start taking care of themselves within the first year and feeding themselves. A human child is dependent for a great many years, which ultimately means, and the brain has to grow, which means not just food, but protein. The mother can't do it, so getting the father to take on the provider role, that's one of the keys to human evolution, to the essence of human. And, the women arranged to do it, to get, select a man who would do it, and is crucial to making culture and everything else possible. But what is it that attracts men to women that will make men commit to becoming a provider for a long period of time? Because none of the other apes take fatherhood seriously.
Mm.
And none of them, care. The idea to tell a gorilla, oh, you should feed your children. I think it's ridiculous. And you should feed the mother of your children every day. That's just some gorilla he had sex with 5 years ago. It's a ridiculous idea to him. But the human males do that. So what is it? And of course, the primary thing in nature that the male is attracted to the female is for sex. So I have to think in this evolutionary process, the men who kind of stayed with the gorilla mentality and said, "What, I'm supposed to double my workload every day and forage for 3 or 4 instead of just myself?" Forget that. They took themselves out of the gene pool. Whereas the males who had a strong enough sex drive, oh yes, I love this woman, I want to be with her, I want to have sex with her on a regular basis, and I'll do whatever it takes. They were the ones that the women could use to become good fathers to their babies. So a high sex drive was probably a factor that women selected men for. It's a bit ironic today with the women protesting men's aggressiveness and the Me Too and stuff, but it's really just, it's another way of using men's sex drive to control them. The more basic one was to get the man to commit for a multi-year period of time. Well, I've read about, say, the hunter-gatherers, and what they say is human civilization's been around for 150,000 years and 140,000. Most of that was hunter-gatherers. Living in cities and farming is a fairly recent development. The hunter-gatherers, they didn't really mate for life, but they've made for 10 years or something, which is long enough for the children to be provided for and start to become more self-sustaining. Around 8 or 9 years old, human children can really be somewhat participants, and they can take care of the younger children and do some gathering and so forth. So for the man to stay with her for that period of time, again, that's really unusual in the great apes, but it's crucial to make culture possible. And culture is our biological strategy. It's how our species solves the universal problems of survival and reproduction. We form a society organized by culture, share information, cooperate, work together, language and economic marketplaces and all these things. And it's a very successful strategy. It works well. But again, it takes a bigger brain, which takes a longer dependency, which means that the woman has to get the man to provide for her and her children over a long period of time.
I know a book that I've heard you say had, I think, some influence on you in the way that you think about culture and relationships between men and women, as I understand it, is a book called Too Many Women, which I had never heard before you mentioned it. If that's correct, what do you remember about that book, and what still resonates about it?
It was a brilliant book. It was early 1980s. I was just a young scholar that's getting started in my career. And I came across it. It was 2 senior people, Marcia Gutentag and Paul Secord. I think it was a married couple. And they looked at sex ratios. So that's the idea of too many women. Sometimes there are too many men. The ideal, I suppose, is to have equal number, so everybody can have a partner. But what happens when there's a surplus or a shortage of one or the other? They looked at different societies which had different sex ratios, because sometimes, some hunter-gatherers just basically kill the baby girls if there are too many, because they produce more. Or sometimes there's a big war and all the males are killed, or there's a shortage, or for whatever reason, there could be imbalances. Essentially, when there's a surplus of males, sexual norms are very prudish. That to get sex, the man has to make a long-term serious commitment, sign his life away and so on. When there's a surplus of women, It's the other way around. Sex is free and easy, and there's more premarital and extramarital sex and so on. Now, the goals of both men and women are are opposite to those. It's not a democracy. It's not a majority rule thing. It's more like an economic market, which is the minority rules on this buyers and sellers. If you think of sex as something where the women are the sellers and the men are the desires, I mean, this point's been made by sex researchers going back to the 70s that in humans and in all other species or most other species, sex is seen as something that the males want from the females. Um, and and so you think of the males as the demand and the females are the supply. So if you have like after a major war and a third of the men were killed or whatever, and then there's a surplus of females, and what happens? Yeah, it's the minority gets the way. The men like it, but there's premarital sex and extramarital sex, and you can have multiple partners, and the one they settle down with better please him, or you can easily find someone else, and so on. And when there's a shortage of women, and some of the extremes were in America's Wild West because of selective migration, it's some of the highest ratios in world history, like 100 men for every woman. And so, there are a few prostitutes around to make money off it. But if you wanted a partner, you wanted to marry someone, you had to sign your life away and do whatever she wanted. And if you lost her, you'd never find another.
Hmm.
The same in China with the one-child policy. A huge deficit of women because they had they could tell during pregnancy what the gender of the baby was and have selective abortion. Presented in the West as some kind of anti-female bias, but when I visited China, I realized the laws were that in China, the parents can make their old parents, when you get old, they don't really have good social security or anything. It may be better now, but the parents can sue their son in court and make him support them. The obligation of a son to support his old parents is not an obligation on the daughter. So, well, of course, you want a son rather than a daughter because when you get old, or if you can't work anymore, you really need somebody to provide for you. So, whatever you think about those laws, but again, it was another case where there's a huge surplus of men, and the sex laws again became very prudent. Essentially, the demand was far greater than the supply.
There's a quote I'd love to read from you that is related to this. It's related to men and women, and it's related to culture. And this is it. It's about, history. Maybe I'll read a couple that are somewhat related, and then the primary quote that came to mind that I think is worth reading. And this is a hilarious one that I heard you give on a podcast interview once. Quote, men will do whatever is required by women in order to obtain sex, and not a whole lot more.
That's one of my general conclusions. I mean, that I'm not sure I like it or want to promote that or whatever, but that seems to fit the data. Again, the examples we've been talking about, to get sexist, the man has to sign his life away and make a permanent promise and commitment and so on. He will do it. And if all he has to do is take it to McDonald's for a quick meal, then he'll do that. And again, not much more.
This is the primary one that came to mind that I want to read. And this is sort of related to men and women in over the generations and over the centuries. And this is also from you. A man wanting to run a farm in 1650 or 1700 really needed a wife. And it didn't matter if he loved her. You didn't really have to get along. The family was an economic unit. But by a couple centuries later, the man is no longer a farmer, and he doesn't have the same need for female input economically. Yeah, this is related, I think, to the Industrial Revolution, and you have spoken about the Victorian era and how that affected, cultural norms and sexual norms about women specifically. What comes to mind when you hear that quote come back at you related to, how things evolve and adapt and change based on what's happening in history?
Quite inspired from Burgess and Locke, some sociologists who wrote it in the kind of the middle of the 20th century, that the family had really changed from an economic unit to a more emotional unit.
Yeah.
If you go back to, say, 1850, a farm family, they're all working together, and the kids had chores, and there was men's work and women's work. You couldn't have a farm with only a man or only a woman. You really needed both. And again, love was a luxury or superfluous, but you needed the man to plow the fields and the woman to make the clothes and can the fruits for winter or whatever. And so by 1950, that just wasn't true anymore. The family was not an economic unit. And so the purpose of the family had changed to be a nexus of emotional relationships. You evaluate your marriage not as, is the farm working? Are we going to survive the winter? Which traditionally was a pretty high priority. But, in the 1950s, it wasn't the case anymore. That you evaluate it based on are my emotional needs being satisfied? Are we taking care of each other and the children? Are we happy? And so on. And the economic output of the family was, as a unit, was near zero. They just usually in the 50s the father worked, the mother usually didn't. Recently the mothers work too, but they don't work together. In most cases, it's not a cooperation. So it's really a profound change in the meaning of the family and a world historical perspective, even.
Yeah. I know that we were mentioning this before we started recording the interview, that your former co-writer and presumably your friend is married to Helen Fisher. I've talked about a lot of the themes that she speaks about, and about, I had a conversation with Richard Reeves about Of Boys and Men, and I talked to Tanya Reynolds a few weeks ago, all kind of circling similar themes about human nature and modernity and where we're heading with all of this. And maybe to ask you about Helen specifically, and some of her research, I think, is applicable to at least some of your work. What have you learned from her? What resonates still for you from what she has written, what she's researched? I'm not sure how familiar you are with her book and her books and publications, but if anything comes to mind, I'd be curious to know what sticks out about her specifically.
Oh, well, this is a hard question for me. She's a brilliant scholar, has had a magnificent career, and her work is mostly published in anthropology, and it's relevant to some of my things, but it wasn't in the kind of stuff I read. I've learned a lot from talking with her, hearing her perspectives on things. But I'd be hard put to have a list of her 5 best ideas or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she wrote a book. She said she spent 5-6 years writing this book to explain men and women, and it just outraged the feminist establishment, and they destroyed it in a week. But she said it's like 2 different feet, the left foot and the right foot. They're different, but you need them both working together. And I think it's a very apt metaphor. The human species really has survived and prospered by virtue of cooperating. There's this sort of feminist pretext that men are oppressing women and they're enemies. I think that doesn't really correspond to what's actually been the reality. Is closer to what Helen Fisher said of men and women working together to cooperate and complement, with an E, complement, each other so that society moves on and children are raised and the culture survives. I mean, most recently, one of the lines sort of resonated in me from Helen is that human men were bred to be suckers. That accountability is one of those traits. Again, women bred men more selectively than men bred women. And if women bred men so that men would be good providers for the women and for their children, which is essential to the success of the species, especially as cultural beings, where you have the long dependency for the brain to grow after for being born. And then making the man amenable to the woman's influence is be a highly desirable trait, probably best for the species, certainly best for the women. But in terms of bred to be suckers, a lot of things fall into place if you look at modern men through that lens.
Yeah. This is a quote that's somewhat related to it. And I think I first was exposed to this idea in Sapiens, where Harari talks about something you mentioned earlier in the conversation, which is the human babies being born prematurely because of the size of their brains, and how that shaped the relationship between men and women in general. And this is the quote from you. In order for humans to evolve the way we did and become these cultural beings, there had to be a whole bunch of changes, including bonding the male and female for a longer time. You spoke, I think you alluded to this earlier in the conversation, but what else do we know? That it seems to me like this is a very important fact and aspect of our history, when human babies were born prematurely, and how it shaped. And maybe you've already answered this question in the sense that women selected men who were open to the kind of loyalty and resource giving that would help them as mothers. Talk about that moment if you can, and how much comes from that fact about human history. You talked about hunter-gatherers bonding for years until children in general were more or less self-sufficient. I'd love to just give you an opportunity to speak to that general concept again.
All right. Well, I want to repeat what I said before, but again, the culture needs a big brain. There's a lot more information to deal with, and rules and laws and norms and customs. There's a lot more for the brain to do. The brain is a very expensive organ. It consumes a lot more calories. That's why we don't see squirrels and mice with big Einstein brains. It's not that just evolution makes you smarter over time. It's a squirrel with an Einstein brain would starve to death because it consumed so much calories it wouldn't get any more food by being that much smarter. So where does the advantage come from being smarter? Well, when you share information, and that's human culture, communication and cooperation are the big human advances in evolution. And when we share information with each other, suddenly there's a lot more for the brain to do. So there's an advantage to having a big brain, but it has to grow after, outside the womb, because the squeezing a giant brain through the woman's birth canal will break it. So we have the long dependency and getting the male to be committed. And my sense is there are a whole bunch of evolutionary changes to bond the male and the female human together that are just not there in the other great apes. Starting with face-to-face sex. They mostly do rear entry, which, gets the job done. but it doesn't create that, you're gazing into each other's eyes and kissing. I don't even know if they do kissing at all, but obviously a big thing with human mating and female orgasms. The nature boosted those, and those bond the male and the female together. I know there was sort of this feminist complaint that the men wanted the women to have orgasms, it's like they were pushing her and so on. But really, you have to think biologically, having one person care about whether the other one is happy, that's that's a big positive step forward. And for evolution to make, I don't think the gorillas care when the male gorillas care if they have sex with the female, if she enjoys it or not. But the humans do, and that produces emotion on both sides. Indeed, the whole thing of passionate romantic love, where you extend over time and being in this person's presence and want to do it, that's got to be a big innovation, or at least a huge increase in bonding the male and the female together. Fathers loving their children also don't see much of that in the other great apes, but obviously it's very strong in humans. My daughter, it was against my principles to love my daughter more than my wife because, your child just goes up by random biological event, whereas you choose your wife as your life partner. And so I'm totally clear I love that little girl more than I'd ever love anybody else. So principles notwithstanding, that's a huge reaction. And that, women have loved their children for way back in evolution, but fathers to love their children, that's another thing that ties people together. And there are probably a few more, and the gullibility, which makes the man more liable to the woman's influence. That's kind of helped the relationship work. So my point is, I think there'll be a whole suite of biological adaptations for the human to get the human male and female stuck together for a period of time. There's a crazier extension of this idea, which I think it's an interesting speculation. I don't at all argue that it's definitely true, but I've been reading the addiction literature, trying to learn about addiction, and it looks like human males get addicted to drugs and alcohol and stuff more than females, and that doesn't seem to be true in other animals. So why would that change suddenly? Why would the evolution produce in the human male this propensity to get addicted to drugs? That's not sensible or adaptive. But if it means getting emotionally attached to a new source of pleasure, that could help tie the man to the woman and make him bind himself to her. My sense too is it's really just the pleasure and bliss kind of drugs that do it. That if you look like the opioids, both men and women get addicted to those. Everybody wants to be rid of pain. Everybody would be happy to go from -5 to 0. But to go to 0 to +5, that's much more of a male thing, seeking that out. And it could be that it was another adaptive thing that made the man attached to the woman. In my studies with McNulty and Meltzer and so on, looked at the course of sexual desire over young marriages over the first 5 years of marriage. And 5 years after marriage, the man's sexual desire is pretty much the same as when he walked down the aisle. There's very little change there, whereas the woman has dropped substantially in most cases. It drops more if she has a child, but even the childless couples, the wife loses interest in sex. But here again, it would be a kind of thing where an addictive attachment for the man would keep him tied to her, even if the sex isn't as plentiful or as good as it was before, as long as it's what we call partial reinforcement. Now and then it is. Occasionally it works, and I think, yeah, that's it, and that's maybe enough to keep the addiction going. So I don't know if this is true. This is a speculation. The thing is, it's hard to come up with any other theory for why human males would be more prone to addiction than human females. There's no obvious theory there. So this is one, but again, it would be something that'd be very valuable for nature to arrange, again, to attach the male to the female, so he keeps providing for her and her children long enough so that they become able to fend for themselves so much, and then the evolutionary test is grandchildren. Do your offspring survive long enough so that they produce offspring? That's that's the done deal.
Yeah, fascinating. And I know I've heard you talk about this book before, the Sex Diaries, in which I think some of the
Yes.
data that you were just conveying, I think, stems from, at least in part, your familiarity with that work, which I think you've already echoed, which relates to male sexual interest in their long-term partner, saying, but yeah.
She contacted me. She published it in Australia and wanted help finding an American publisher, and I'm sorry, there wasn't any help, but we kind of became friends, and I read the book. But that's what made me ask to my colleagues who are experts in the study of relationships, McNulty and Meltzer, is this true? I mean, the journalist found it in her haphazard sample of people she followed, but is it true that? And they said it's not in the literature, but they said we actually have two different studies tracking married couples over the first 5 years of marriage. They say it's somewhere in our data. They didn't know what the answer was,
Yeah.
but they said we will go and look and see what the answer is. And so complicated, there's a huge amounts of data and stuff. It took a while, but they went and analyzed and said, oh yes, it is true. The men's desire pretty much steady over the early years of marriage, whereas the wife's drops substantially. They also showed couples' satisfaction with their marriage drops substantially in step with the wife's loss of desire. The man's sexual desire is irrelevant to how happy the couples are, but as the woman loses desire, they become less happy. And I thought we should get this message out. I tried to get McNulty to write a big op-ed or something like that. He's busy with other stuff, but probably what happens is the man and the woman, they court, and these days they're having sex before marriage, and it's really good, and they're happy, and so on. I think, okay, this is the way it's going to be. And then a couple of years in the marriage, she doesn't really want to do it so much anymore, but he really does. And so, in a sense, they grow apart in terms of their sexual desires. And I bet what often happens is they blame each other or blame themselves. And, oh, look, there's a problem in our marriage. We're not in tune sexually the way we were, back when we were courting or about to get married. And there's something wrong? And they should understand, no, there's not something wrong with you. It's not. This is a standard problem. This is normal. It's a problem you should solve as a couple. It's not a problem that something is wrong with you as a couple. And figure out what you're going to do about it. But this is the typical pattern. But without that knowledge, of course, the woman would think, oh, somehow you're not charming me as much anymore, and the man thinks, well, you're not satisfying me as much anymore, and again, they blame themselves or blame each other, but either way, it's going to undermine their satisfaction with the marriage.
Yeah. Do you view this mostly as like a bell curve where this is the average outcome, and there are exceptions to this where long-term couples don't experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is distributed. Almost everything is distributed with a bell curve with a normal distribution. Yes. I mean, on average, it's very clear men have higher desire for sex than women, but there are some women with really high sexual desire. Mostly young ones at a certain age. There are one or two studies of them, and they have trouble making friends with other women because they don't see things the same way, and they don't understand each other. Yeah, one or two. It's different for them. They have they can certainly, if they want sex as much as a man, it's usually easy for the woman to find the partners, whereas men have trouble finding the women who want to do as much as they do. But again, it's a complicated thing. But anyway, in answer to your question, yes, of course, there's a wide range of distribution, and people are different. We're just talking about broad averages.
And I know this was a question I wanted to ask you because I'm certain you've given some pretty deep thought to this about, given what you know about men and women and all the information that we've been talking about today, do you think it's unwise to expect for most people a lifelong monogamous relationship to be feasible? That's drilled into us. At least, you and I are both Americans. I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania. I think if I remember correctly, you grew up in Cleveland. So we grew up in the same vicinity.
Yeah.
What do you make of that question? What do you think is the practical, realistic outlook on what is arguably the most important arena of human affairs in an individual life?
Yeah, I haven't totally figured this out yet. The data are not perfect on this kind of question. In general, it looks like people who are married for a long time are better off than people who are single or who marry and divorce, and so on. Marriage has a bunch of good effects on men and on women too. If we talk monogamy as in never having sex with anyone else, well, that's going to take some renunciation and probably puts more of a strain on the man than on the woman. But the data on how much that happens, I haven't looked at them for a while, and it's not clear people tell the truth either to the sociologists asking them questions. But if you look in any given year, over 90% of married people only have sex with their spouses. If you look accumulated over a great many years, well, a lot of people will have an occasional fling or something with someone else. It looks like this is more important to men and more desirable to men than to women, although it's again, the data are not totally persuasive or clear. And women might just be less willing to admit it. Even the issues of what counts as sex, when they count how many, researchers ask how many sex partners have you had, the men have always had a lot more than the women, which is statistically implausible. And there are multiple things contributing, but one of them is what counts as sex. So a lot of the borderline cases, the men are glad to count it and the woman isn't. So the difference may be smaller than some of the survey numbers count. You're going to go back to evolution and biology. The other apes, our biological relatives, are not monogamous. So this is an innovation in humankind, and it's going to be incomplete. And if people could do whatever they want, I doubt they'd be completely monogamous, but they do like to form a strong attachment and be mostly monogamous. That does seem to resonate with human motivation, and it works pretty well for society. Obviously, culture can build on nature and say, okay, you get one spouse and that's it, and make it illegal to have sex with anyone else ever. not allowed to get a divorce, and once you have sex with someone, that's it for your life. So we are not by nature a fully monogamous species, but we incline in that direction. And monogamy, with a few exceptions, are what the sociologists call serial monogamy, that you have an intense relationship, an exclusive relationship with one person for a few years, and then you break up, and then you have another intense relationship with someone else. And during that time, you don't have sex with anyone else. But over the course of a lifetime, you have.
Yeah. I know we're getting towards the end of the conversation, and I found a lot of your research on a topic that has long interested me too, that I knew I wanted to address with you and bring up in the end of the conversation, which is a totally different subject, the subject of willpower. And I thought maybe in the transition over to this subject, I would just read a couple of quotes from you as well related to willpower, which I thought resonated with me and were interesting and might be a proper way to segue into this subject. And here are a few of them. This is from you. What stress really does is deplete willpower, which diminishes your ability to control emotions. This is another one. The best way to reduce stress in your life is to stop screwing up. And then the two final ones. One is, this is another line from you: lock yourself into a virtuous path. Maybe that relates to some of what we were just speaking about, related to how it's really complicated with human nature and monogamy, but the virtuous path might be the generally the more preferable. And then this is how I think you start the book in one of the first few pages, your book, Willpower. However you define success, a happy family, good friends, a satisfying career, robust health, financial security, the freedom to pursue your passions, it tends to be accompanied by a couple of qualities. And my understanding is one of those qualities is your ability to assert your will on the world. And it's become fashionable, I think, through a couple of very well-known, public intellectuals. Two that come to mind are Robert Sapolsky and Sam Harris, who have asserted with their brilliance and their eloquence and their writing and speaking that free will does not exist, that it is it's an illusion. And on certain days when I hear those arguments, I am completely persuaded by what they have to say. And it's been this ongoing riddle in my own life, just selfishly trying to come to terms with what is real related to the will and free will. I certainly was raised with that idea, and it became a central part of my identity when I was young, the importance of your willpower and will in general. So maybe I'll just start this segment of the conversation by asking you, in your research, in your understanding of the brain and human nature, does free will exist?
Yeah, I'm just finishing a book with Oxford University Press called A Scientific Theory of Free Will. So, yes, I mean, one point I made earlier is I talked to a lot of scientists who don't believe in free will, and others who do. And I find that I mostly agree with both of them. They're not talking about it's a terminology argument, and the ones who are against it, they think it's some kind of the soul is causing behavior independent of biological processes. I don't believe in that either. But the ones in favor are behavioral flexibility, being able to act differently in the same situation. That, I think, is real and highly adaptive and evolved to a high level in our species. So, and a lot of the arguments about free will are just disputes over terminology. The thing that gets me is the people who believe in free will and the people who don't. Say both psychological scientists. You'd think they must have radically different ideas about how
Mm.
behavior is caused. They don't. They mostly go through the same stuff, and they also they agree that the human mechanism in the mind that causes behavior is just radically different from anything else in nature. We are moral agents, so we can incorporate abstract ideas into the causation of behavior. We can project into the future, simulate multiple pathways,
Mm.
Economic marketplaces. There's nothing like this in the world. So the human behavior control system is this marvelous new evolutionary product. And the two sides just disagree as to whether that deserves to be called free will. Okay, well, I'm not interested in the terminological argument. The scientific problem is how does this remarkable new capacity for controlling behavior work? I'd say we might as well keep the term. It's not the best term. If we were just discovering this today, we might come up with a different term. But given the centuries of discussion, we might as well preserve it. And for me, the free part is more plausible. The will part is the problem. There's no psychology of the will. The will is clearly a metaphor, like against our will or something. But you grab any introductory psychology textbook. There's no chapter on the will. It's not a thing. But freedom, clearly, some actions are freer than others. Everybody has that experience, and so to me, that's the scientific challenge. What moves people up or down along that continuum? And when the situation permits a greater freedom of choice, what are the psychological processes that begin? That's the reality of free will. Whether it deserves to be called free will, I'll leave that for other people to debate.
Yeah, I know many years ago, one of my favorite philosophers, Dan Dennett, wrote a book called Freedom Evolves, which uh, I'm guessing you're familiar with some of his arguments. And I mean, to me, what
Right at the same time, I was writing the cultural animal book and kind of making the point that yes, we evolved the capacity for freedom. He's a wonderful book, and he's a brilliant guy. He didn't really explain the evolutionary process that much. He didn't go into that, so it was a bit frustrating me. And philosophers understand problems in a different way, and he was addressing the ones the way they look at it. But for me, coming in as a psychologist, wanting to see the evolution, I didn't get that from that. But I'm very sympathetic to the conclusion, and yes, this new capacity for action control is something that humans evolved. That's again whole order of magnitude or a whole category different from what all the other apes do to control their behavior.
yeah, I mean, in my read on people, what people really care about is the ability to have agency and some influence over the trajectory of their life and the ability. To me, that's when I started running into the determinism and no free will arguments. I think why they were so unsettling is, yeah, I took them to mean that that does not exist. That there is no, uh, freedom, for lack of a better word, for people to be able to mold their direction in a way that makes sense to them. So outside of the semantics of what the terminology is, in your estimation, do you think that exists, that that's real for the human mind and people in general?
It's what's in my what is it is real?
A sense, a real capacity for agency and a degree of self-determination for your.
The complication here is not does agency exist, but what's the relation to human free will? Because mice will do that. A cat chases the mouse, and it will have to choose whether to run left or right.
Yeah.
But it knows it better run somewhere. uh, so uh, agency goes way back in evolution. the human form is advanced and incorporates new and grander things into it, but it builds on the simpler one.
Hmm. And in your, I think you said you're in the process of writing this book. What are you discovering? What's new in your mind? What has been uncovered in your thinking that you found fascinating or uh, persuasive that comes to mind, if anything, related to the subject?
Well, there's quite a bit. Your hours up. I could spend a separate hour if you want back again when the book comes out. That
Yep.
would be fun. But um, there are some things clear, as I said, that the way that the human brain moves tells the muscles to move the bones. And that's how behavior occurs in every animal. But the process in the human brain is light years ahead, qualitatively different from what the others have. Late in the book, I'm pondering how much of a motivation is there to do that? Is it just an ability, or do we have like an instinctive desire? I mean, the desire for control, not fully convincing, but pretty much. I mean, animals have learned helplessness. They're deprived of control. They suffer and show pathological reactions. Um, Humans like to do it. It seems like we like to have options more than we like to go through the hard process of making a difficult decision.
Hmm.
It could be the essence of free will, but it's not that fun. People want to have good reactions easily. They're more oriented toward the outcome than the process. Um, and one of the key themes in my thinking is that the human psyche was designed by evolution, but for culture. Culture is how our species solve the eternal problems of survival and reproduction. And it works very well within a population where we tripled our life expectancy because of culture, and our population has gone from, first few females to 8 billion people in a couple 100,000 years. It's a very successful one. So the traits that make us human, the essence, or the human essence, basically the result of biological adaptations to make culture possible. Most obvious is language, being able to speak and talk and share information. No other species has anything but language. They do communicate a little bit, but linguists say none of that rises to language. But every human culture has language. So that's one obvious one. And free will would be one of those. Another, the ability to make decisions and carry out plans and navigate a complex social environment with rules and constraints, but opportunities. That takes a pretty advanced action control system. Should we call it free will? I think it's good enough. It's a perfect term. But yes, it is. It is beyond anything else seen in nature.
Yeah. Roy, I know our time is about up, so I just want to say how much I love your work. I would love to talk to you whenever this new book is out in more detail about willpower and free will in general. I think that would be fascinating. Maybe to close, to me, I've had 3 or 4 people who have been deeply involved in evolutionary psychology, either as ev psych professors or people who have kind of dipped their toe in that water for intensely for a period of their career. I'd love to close maybe by asking you how that field, we've talked about some of the more fascinating aspects of it, but how it's affected you or influenced you. If there's anything else related to ev psych that you find, mind blowing or not particularly well known in the general culture that you think is worth articulating at the end here, I'd love to give you an opportunity to speak about that.
Oh well, that's a big question. I don't know what I can say, but it's been a sweeping and fundamental change. I mean, my attitude, I was raised by wolves, and I decided to believe what they believed, and I wanted to end up knowing the truth, and I assume I don't start out. So I've just always thought all my ideas are subject to revision, and I want to keep revising until I get there. When I first took my psychology classes as an undergraduate at Princeton, I remember the professor in personality psychology saying, well, personality is something that's learned. The idea that there are genes or biological stuff, there might be a little of that, but not. So don't pay attention. Personality is something that comes from socialization. And over the years, the evolutionary people have convinced me that that's wrong. It's not completely wrong, but there's big a big head start based on the biological endowment and those studies that showing identical twins who were raised apart end up more similar than non-identical twins raised in the same household. Well, it's a pretty compelling sign that biology and genes contribute to it. There's, of course, all the mating stuff, and that in just about every society in the world, women's mate appeal depends on how attractive and sexy they are, and it depends on how much money they have, how many resources they have. And, the other matters a little bit too, but it's quite disproportionate. That most societies, men want to have more sex partners than women do. These basic things, they don't explain everything. I don't call myself an evolutionary psychologist because some people who do define themselves that way get carried away and think it explains everything. Well, it doesn't explain it. But it is the starting point. It explains a lot. And so for me to incorporate that into my thinking in the 70s and 80s, that was a big fundamental and sweeping change. So yeah, the psyche starts that way. Like I said, the human mind was made by nature for culture.
Hmm.
And so it's highly adaptive. Remember school back in the 1960s and revealing my age and saying, oh, the translating machines are just around the corner. The computers are going to be able to translate stuff. It took a long time. I guess they're getting better now, but that's not perfect. The machine doesn't really understand it. But if they should be able to do that, I'll really be impressed when they can make a computer that can do what any human baby does, which is plop it down anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And it can listen to the conversations and pick it up and learn the language from that. Then I'll be impressed.
Yeah.
Rest of the other stuff there, but the fact that the human baby just learns the customs and the language and everything else from its environment is very costly. That's, I think, why nature turns it off. Why children should learn foreign languages when they're in elementary school and not leave it to university. They pick it up so easily. Here in Europe, they have friends who, when they have a baby, they start by teaching it a different language. They said, oh, they'll learn the local language fast enough as soon as they go to school. But teach it something different, and it learns it, and then it's got it. It learns so easily at that age. Again, the brain evolved to pick up and adapt to the culture really well.
Yeah, well said. Roy, thank you again for taking the time. I know it's late where you are over in Europe. I really appreciate it. And your stuff is absolutely mind-blowing and fascinating. So thanks again for doing this.
Okay, thanks.